Welcome back to the Saturday edition of Locked On Women's Basketball, the internet's only women's basketball draft-focused podcast. Today, we're providing you with an inside look at our scouting and evaluation process as amateur scouts. How do we watch film? What do we look for in prospects? What skills and skill sets do we generally value more than others? We'll dive into these questions and more. Locked On Women's Basketball starts now.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Welcome. You are at Locked On Women's Basketball. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get podcast and on YouTube. My name is Hunter Cruse. I'm your Saturday host, covering the WNBA Draft and prospect scouting. I'm joined by co-hosts Adler and Lincoln Shafer. Covers the WNBA with a focus on player development and the game within the game. Lincoln is our biomechanics guru and contributes to our WNBA Draft coverage at The Next. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, so to get into this episode, we're going to open up by talking about our film watching process. So for you, Em, what is the first thing you look for whenever you're watching film? And how do you go about watching film on draft prospects?
So the most important thing, I think, is to see if she got that dog in her. And then after that, you want to see just how much she got that dog in her. You know, it's not about the size of the dog in the fight. It's about the size of the fight in the dog. And that means athleticism. That means just how they can take over the game. I think it sort of varies. You know, I have answered sort of this question before, and I don't always have a great answer for it because it is just so subjective. It's really trying to get a feel for the different kind of X factors that come along with a player. This is, I think, actually one of the valuable things that we talked about a couple weeks ago when it came to the AI discussion, is that, you know, those are the sort of things that you're trying to get a handle on either directly or indirectly. And I think those are the things that I think you don't look for. You don't start off looking for a game saying, I want to see how many players are good at this or that. It's more of just being able to feel what those things look like or feel what those things feel like. And from there, be able to recognize that as it pops up in different games. Because, you know, to be good at this, you got to be interested in watching ball anyway. And the more you watch, the more you see.
Yeah, the number one thing is to watch, for me, was at least to watch, frankly, a fiscally irresponsible amount of basketball. Is a whole lot of my time dedicated to sitting in front of a computer screen or a TV screen. You know, sometimes you can get the 4 games at once on ESPN or Big Ten Plus. You know, you can watch so much basketball that's available to you. Shout out to the YouTube channels that post full games clips on their YouTube channels. I appreciate them. Women's Basketball Alliance is one of the reasons that I got into this. They post so much basketball, and you can watch so much basketball for free. And when you watch a ton of basketball, you start to notice things. The more you watch, the more you can pick up on. Another thing that was big for me is just like listening to other people who are very smart and know basketball talk about the game. That helps you grow a deeper understanding, whether that's people involved in the leagues or some of my personal favorites are Nikias and Steve at the Dunker Spot. They do great work. They talk about women's basketball all the time, and they know the game very, very well. And listening to people and talking to people who like basketball, who watch basketball, who understand the game is always going to help you grow your own understanding of the game.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that has helped me more in terms of scouting. At least once I was already sort of into this way of watching games, I don't think there is anything that has helped me more personally than branching out from this being a one-person operation to this being the 3 of us.
The other big jump for me was I started taking notes and writing things down, taking clips, whether that's a screen recording or an external app where you can plug videos in and get clips out. if you take notes and you add clips and screenshots and as much video, picture, film evidence that you have ways to back up your arguments. That's going to help you understand your own viewing of the game better.
And one thing you said there was about getting clips and getting data points. And I think that's something that's big for me is like with film watching, you can't really focus on just a senior year sample. I think that's something a lot of people get caught up in is where they focus on just the draft year, where it's really important to look at the freshman, the sophomore, the senior, junior, and senior year sample. Like with the WNBA side, it's so much different than scouting for the NBA because it was something we were looking at with Janiah Barker, where whenever you're a WNBA prospect, you don't really need to look back at high school samples. But on the men's side, you really have to rely a lot on junior, senior year, AAU tape because the players are in college for 1 year. But on the WNBA side, there's just so much more data samples. There's so much more information. There's such a larger sample size in general for you to just feel stronger about your evaluation.
A notable example of that is as we branch out into, trying to evaluate more players at different ages, at different years, sometimes you realize that someone who shot 40% from three over a fairly extended stretch to start their career actually has only once hit 70% from the line since she graduated middle school. And that's not good. That's not good in terms of projection. I'm talking about Janiah Barker, to be specific. We recently found out that she actually can't hit free throws, and that's probably not good for what we think her shooting will be.
And I think another thing that's also really important for me is to always know that you're never going in blind on a prospect. Like you're never going in with no thought at all about a player. You've either seen a highlight or you've seen the stats. You always know something. And I think it's important with that to try to keep as open as mind as possible, because something I've gotten myself caught into is writing a prospect off too quick or jumping to a conclusion on a prospect, something they do well. Whenever someone could start shooting from three well for 10 games, then the next 10 games they're not shooting well, and then they never get back to where they were at before. Like there's such like a wave in how players play that you really can't just come to a conclusion immediately on players as well.
The funny thing about you mentioning, not seeing anyone without knowing anything going in, you always know something, is that does happen to me. I can confirm. Sometimes, for example, last year, I watched in the women's college basketball season, I watched to varying degrees, 118 different teams at one point or another. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, at different points, random players pop up. Is essentially what I've described before as, Hunter finding random international prospects for us is sort of how I find random college players who are like, this player on Oklahoma State is doing really well from three and is like kind of holding up as a passer in surprising ways, just because I was interested in why this random Big 12 team that should have been like in the bottom third of the league is actually beating good teams. This is actually exactly how I started watching a little more of Anna Gradasi, the international transfer from Arizona to Oklahoma State before the prior season. And, I'm not saying she's a prospect at this point, but, in like a 30-team league, she'd be a very interesting, like late first rounder. And this is just sort of, you go in just wanting to watch some hoop and be interested in the games themselves. And, sometimes players pop up and you go, ooh, that's fun. And when it happens a bunch, you go, ooh, this player is fun. You go from there.
Yeah, going back to Hunter's earlier point about how we have so much more sample in the women's game than the men's game, your average NBA draft pick who's going to go in the top 5, like Paolo Banchero, who was the number 1 pick in 2022, played 1,280 college minutes. Assuming that Caitlin Clark goes number 1 this year, which I think we all assume is very likely, that will make 3 straight number 1 overall picks out of college in women's basketball that have played over 3,700. So we have three times, sometimes even 4 times the minute sample as you do for a one and done player on the men's side. So there's so much more basketball that you get to watch.
Right. So after the break, we'll get into our scouting philosophy. What do we look for in players? What are some skill sets that we value more than others, and more? Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On fantasy basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed to fit your roster. So let's see who Josh has picked for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. Our player Josh is looking for is Marvin Bagley III at the Washington Wizards. With Daniel Gafford in concussion protocol, Bagley has a nice shot of getting minutes on his new team for the short term. I know M probably agrees. Marvin
Let's
Bagley,
go Duke!
Legend. Josh Lloyd from Locked On Women's Basketball is going to help you win your fantasy championship, and eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with the vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED lights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs. eBay Motors has it, and with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Motors Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, I'm your host, Hunter Cruse, and before we get back into our conversation on our scouting philosophy as it pertains to the 2024 WNBA Draft and beyond, I want to inform you that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national sports shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. So I want to pose this question by saying, what is your scouting philosophy? I know with scouting philosophies in general, there's many ways you can go. I think every scout values different things. Every team has different things they look for in players. What about you, Em, to start off?
I think this pertains to what I was saying before in terms of the AI thing, in terms of looking for X factors. The most important thing is not leaving scouting in a not leaving scouting in a vacuum. And this is whether you're looking at amateur scouting or whether you're looking at pro scouting, self-scouting your own team, scouting other teams to see, for player acquisitions and whatnot. It is really important to have a synergy and to not silo off your player development and your scouting. If you can turn them into if you can really do well in integrating them, like some of the best teams in baseball do, then, you have a robust system and that you're really making as efficient and as effective as possible to what is, I think, sort of self-evidently the most important aspect of any team in any franchise. So I think coming into scouting with that, it's having a good handle on what I know I can teach, what I know I can help find people who can teach, and going from there. There are different aspects of footwork that are more teachable than others. There are aspects of a shot that can easily be cleaned up, and there are other aspects that, I don't know if I can clean it up, but I know someone who might be able to. And being able to bridge the gap from there and being able to say, okay, we can handle this flaw in a player, we can handle that flaw in a player, and from there being able to hone in on the skills that, then become even more important. For me, I come from the sort of attitude where I shouldn't say almost anything, but a lot of things are teachable, at least in the right context. And, that means when you're looking for things, you're looking for those skills that, I talked about a couple of weeks ago that really can't be taught the same way.
And how you say that a lot can be teachable. That's why it's so important to value positional size, athleticism, tools, because you can't teach size, you can't teach wingspan. So with a lot of prospects, like for example, Angel Reese is kind of like a great example with her, where you really bet on the tools if you're really taking her at a high pick, because you're betting on the tools, you're betting on your developmental infrastructure to really get out of her skills that she has. And that's what's tough about scouting in the public spaces, because you don't have a specific team, you don't have a specific need or anything. You're really just scouting generally. What skills do you value? What skill sets do you value? And how does that project on a general scale if a player just gets picked by any team? Like there's some prospects where if they get picked by X team, they have a better chance of succeeding than they get picked by Y team. But that's what it makes it difficult for us, because you're ranking players without knowing that.
Yeah, team specific contexts are always going to be more important when you're doing like for working for a team is going to be a different process than what we do. We're just watching basketball and kind of coming up with our own opinions. Something that I value is like a skill set that doesn't quite match size or position. Like, is there a big who's an especially fluid passer who can make plays that are uncommon for their position? Is there a 5'6" guard who's an extraordinary rim protector? Shout out to Sarah Andrews, who's maybe the best rim protector under 5'7" in college basketball right now. Uh, and I like players that do things that they're not supposed to, but do them well. Another thing for me is I'm looking at movement skills, fluidity, explosiveness. Like if you watch Becky Hammon, she doesn't move like a typical mid-major point guard. She's more athletic, more fluid, and she sees the floor incredibly well, which is very obvious from the first time watching her. And the same thing with players like Tamika Catchings. They move and interact with the game around them in a way that is unique, which is one of the advantages we have of scouting specific players. I think that when you're watching a team and you have the ability to just watch one player, you're able to get so much nuance out of that game than you're not getting if you're just watching the ball the whole time.
And that's why I think it's important in sort of a wider context to be able to watch a game, both as a scout that is watching, one player individually and how they interact with their environment and how they solve problems relating to environmental stimuli, whether that be complex movement problems, whether that be dynamic problem solving, critical thinking skills, and also being able to do so in the way that a coach and a film scout analyst does, where you're able to sort of take in the whole movement of 5 players. If you're really great at this, 10, usually not, but at least the 5 players on one team at a time and how they interact with each other and how they build up those dynamics. It's hard in this kind of sport to scout players individually and while leaving out their team contexts. We are talking about, sort of on the Janiyah Barker example from before, there are ways in which her game has been very underwhelming this year outside of the shooting, but there's also ways in which the team dynamic has changed significantly and it runs things through her differently. It has different usage of her, and whether that plays up to or plays out of her skill is really important for trying to figure out, what are the trends we're looking at here. And I think that's just building off that last word. I think it's one of the important things in the wider context of doing this sort of thing. Is a big part of your evaluation is what is the wider trend of development here? What is the wider sort of arc of this player's career looking like? Charisma Osborne, for example, has basically been the same player every year, and that's a really good player, but that almost certainly means unless you are really confident in the ability of your coaching, of your program, to be able to sort of teach skills in a different way and to unlock things that others don't, you're probably getting, again, the same player. In other contexts, you look at someone like Paige Beckers, whose defense has improved massively every year. I think probably the easiest example, and I'm sure you guys would probably agree, Nafisa Collier came into college. She had played for Team USA. She didn't play much for good reason. She was probably one of the rawest, highly regarded players I think we've ever seen on a college court, and clearly displayed good skills for the size, good instincts, and you can see drastic improvement year to year while at UConn, and that continued through her senior year. And you can say, and I think it's fair to say, going off that, there's probably more here that we can work off of. And what do you know? There still is.
And I think with prospects, like you said, it's so much on the context, what their situation is, what their role is. There's some players where they're playing out of their role. Like you're projecting them to be a role player, and they are handling the number one usage on a team. Like that's something we talk about with someone like Maddie Shear at Kentucky, where role is important, system is important, surrounding talent's also important. The coaching, what kind of system are they running? Are they running what kind of defense are they running? Some we talk about with some defenses that run zone. Like how do you evaluate a player in a system that is not very common in the pros?
I think one of the fun things with that specifically is when you have a player who, the athleticism is going to hit, but the role is also probably going to be decreased, just in terms of the usage and the primacy going to the next level. When you have someone whose role is going to be decreased and their athleticism isn't necessarily standout, then you have to navigate different things, and it's sort of interesting how you try to figure out what is going to have a bigger effect: the increase in the athletic baseline of where they're going, that competition, or the fact that they'll be in a little easier spots. But it's really fun, I think, when you get it both ways. For example, JC Sheldon, who is definitely not going to be a primary grade at the next level, might even be the third best guard on the starting lineup, but clearly has the sort of, maybe not the strength, but like the speed, the lateral quickness, the horizontal movement to be a standout performer at the WNBA. So when you have someone whose athleticism is clearly going to hit and they're going to be decreasing in role, you can sort of work your way around the increase in level of talent. And it becomes an interesting question of, there's probably a certain, not a certain like big level of upside, but there is different ways that they can influence the game that we're not necessarily seeing right now, but that will have the opportunity to do so because of their athleticism.
Yeah, after the break, we'll wrap up today's episode by talking about how we balance analytics versus our eye test and just the overall vibes of a player and more. With the basketball season in full swing, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League, a league that is specifically made for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. For example, LeBron James plus Travis Kelce at 10.5 combos of three-pointers made plus receptions. PrizePicks even offers a reboot policy so that if your entry stays in even if a player gets injured. For football and basketball games, a player who exits before the second half, that player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. Go to PrizePicks.com and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code PrizePicks.com/LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, the daily fantasy sports app made easy. All right, so I want to open this last section by talking about how we balance the analytics versus the eye test versus our initial expectations and our initial feelings on a player. So for you, Em, when you watch a player, how much is it important to look at the stats while you're watching a player, or do you try to watch a player and focus on the film before you consider what the stats look like, if that makes sense?
The first thing I do before I open my tape every morning is I go and I look at everyone's REPM stats and I memorize how much they've changed from day to day. And that's how I rate every player in college basketball. The second thing I do is I then look at their on-off net rate. No, I'm kidding. All of that stuff is basically irrelevant. The stats, I think, it's different when it comes to scanning for basketball and scanning for other sports. Football and soccer obviously are what they are, and those are, sports where it is so difficult to separate the intrinsically linked and interdependent nature of players and their schemes and who's next to them and the various different positions and roles they're asked to fulfill. In basketball, it's not baseball where we can actually look at some stats and tell most of the story of what a player is. We're talking about sort of Z contact, chase rate, all these sorts of things. In basketball, there are things that you really can't ignore when it comes to the statistical profile. Like I said, when it comes to the wider arc, for example, Janiah Barker, when it comes to the wider arc of free throw shooting, 3-point shooting, we can't just project, hey, this is a good looking shot. If the free throws aren't hitting and the free throw form looks very good, then what are you going to do with that player to try to actually make them into a good shooter when you're going from there? These are the sort of questions you have to answer, and these are the sort of things you want to have a statistical signal to back up your observations if they are verifiable, if they are falsifiable. But, it's not the end all be all. The first thing and last thing really should be what you're seeing on tape, because there's really no other way to understand in basketball, or really in any sport though, the question isn't just what is happening, but for scouting, because so much of it is projection, it's not just how, or it's not just what, but it's how and why.
Yeah, and so much of what we do is context dependent that I think it's impossible to get a full overview without film or without analytics. I think it's important for a scout to be somewhat statistically literate, even if the analytics are not really analytics, but just base stats. I'm not a huge fan of all-in-one number metrics. I think they're reductive and they miss that people are asked to do different things, but sometimes they can be useful in estimating value. But it's important to understand what these stats are trying to measure and not just taking them blindly and running with that. But to me, it's a process of watching film first, and when something pops out to me, I kind of approach it like the scientific method. I have a hypothesis from my film watching and the notes that I've taken and my priors on the player, and I see if that continues, and I check it with stats. Shout out to her Hoop Stats, who does awesome work and has all kinds of things that you could ever want. Their search function is really fun to find interesting quirks about players or things like that. But her Hoop Stats is, I think, the most visited website on my browser, and I like to double check what my eyes are seeing with I like to look at game logs more than like season long stats, so I can see what a player's doing in each game rather than a 30 game sample. I like to look one game at a time to see how consistent things are and what changes from game to game and in specific contexts. But all of this has to be backed up by also watching the tape.
Yeah, I think one thing that I look at as far as analytics is how a player finishes at the rim in the half court versus transition. This is something that I've talked about a lot with someone like Celeste Taylor, where she gets so much of her finishes in transition because of Ohio State's scheme, how they press, how they get easy finishes and transition off the press. So in the half court, how does she finish? And if you look at her finishing stats in half court versus transition, it's like a 30% gap. And that's also similar to how I look at with some players, contested versus uncontested shooting. Because a contested shooter, if they're making contested threes at a high rate, that's probably going to translate. Just generally going to translate better because they're drawing closeouts, they're able to make more shots, they're able to draw the defense out. And if they're just making a lot of their threes uncontested, it's kind of obvious that the defense is not respecting them, and there's probably a reason for that. So I think in general, it's important to look at kind of both the ends. And sometimes you find a rare example where a player is better on contested than uncontested. So it's just all data points for me.
And there's an interesting marriage between having that data and seeing something enough in person to, or not necessarily in person, but in person or on film to get a feel for it, independent of that. So you watch Ohio State 2-3 times, and then you look at the stats and you see the difference between that half-court transition finishing for Celeste Taylor. I, on the other hand, could have told you the same conclusion, but not because I ever looked at those stats, but because she played at Duke for 2 years, and I was covering the team as the primary beat writer on the team for 2 years, and I watched her enough to tell you, man, this is a really rough job watching her generate looks in the half-court and not be able to finish them repeatedly. And again, these are the things that you want to be backing up between your scout and the tape. If things that are falsifiable aren't falsified, or I guess unfalsified by the data, then you want to be able to have a reason why. We don't craft observations, and we don't look at stats and craft a narrative around them just for the sake of crafting a narrative and having a nice story to tell about the world. The universe itself is inherently irrational, and things will not resolve themselves. People contain multitudes, and everyone has cognitive dissonance and so many of their deeply held beliefs that trying to create, very nice, neat, and fully accurate narratives about the world it's always going to be a futile effort. But when it comes to trying to do that with stats and with your observations and trying to mold it all into one, that is it's a very understandable instinct, but it's also not something that really serves any good purpose. But you at least want to be able to say why there is or is not an agreement between your observations and stats, if that is a possibility. Because otherwise, you're just sort of throwing stuff at the wall and you're not actually able to integrate all the knowledge that we have. And what we know is that it all matters.
Yeah, I think overall it's about balancing the stats, it's about balancing the film, and it's also about balancing, not really for us, but for evaluators and teams, is how a player interacts with their teammates, how they interact with their coaches, how teachable are they, how coachable are they, how much do they really love the game. All that stuff is important to developing or projecting development on players, because if a player doesn't love the game and they're really relying on their tools, that's stuff that teams are going to look at, and that's stuff teams are going to value, and how they select players, how they rank players on their board. So I think overall it's a very fluid process with how you scout. There's really no one way. There's really no one perfect formula. Every team has their hits and misses, and that's the same thing for us. So thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. Join the team at the back next week for continued coverage of women's college basketball and the draft. Make your second listen Locked On Sports today, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Have a great rest of your weekend, everyone.